Welcome, wanderers of the night. I am Mooncat, your guide through the shadows of forgotten tales and haunting whispers. As we journey together into the depths of mystery and the unknown, I invite you to become a part of our tale. If the echoes of these stories linger in your mind, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps the candle burning in the dark corners of these forgotten places. Now, let us begin. The estate stood silent as it had for decades, a skeletal silhouette against the pale wintry sky. Its once grand facade, now cracked and weathered, whispered of forgotten splendor and whispered secrets. The long abandoned halls were filled with shadows that stretched like ghostly fingers, reaching out for the unwary. It was here, in this place of desolation, that Charles Redmayne had chosen to return. Charles Redmayne, a man whose blood bore the weight of generations, had never set foot upon the land that was now his. The estate, sprawling remnant of faded grandeur, had been a bit of Britain place in his youth, a silence between his father and mother. They had spoken of it in muted tones, their words clipped and brief, as if even the mention of the place might invoke some ancient maledicts. Jessortinkle, the last of the Redmayne line, save for Charles himself, that had summoned him to this forsaken domain. His great uncle had been a figure of myth in Charles' childhood, an eccentric recluse who hived himself away from the world, his life a mystery even to his kin. Charles had never met him, had never been allowed to visit the estate, though as a child he had harboured a dark curiosity about the place. The reasons for its abandonment, whispered among the townsfolk but never confirmed. Some said the estate was cursed, others that it was simply too costly to maintain. But those who spoke in the darkest corners of the village claimed the true reason was far more sinister, an ancient wrong that tainted the land, driving its inhabitants to madness or worse. Now, as Charles stood on the threshold of the estate, he felt a deep unease, a sense that he was stepping into a story already half told. The solicitor's letter had been curt, almost dismissive, as if eager to rid itself of the burden it bore. You are the sole heir, the estate is... And with that, Charles had found himself drawn to this place, bound by duty, and an inexplicable pull that gnawed at his reason. Why had he come? The question circled in his mind like a vulture. Was it to claim what was rightfully his? To uncover the secrets that had driven his great-uncle to isolation? Or was it something deeper? Something buried in the marrow of his bones, a call to face the shadows that had haunted his family for centuries. He had not wanted to come. The truth of it gnawed at him, though he would not admit it aloud. The estate represented everything he had sought to escape, a legacy of sorrow, of guilt passed down from father to son like an heirloom of rusted iron. Yet he was standing before the ivy-choked gates, his breath fogging in the cold air, feeling like a man about to enter a tomb rather than a home. The estate had been abandoned for decades, left to decay under the weight of its own history. His great-uncle had lived here alone, a ghost among the crumbling walls, refusing to sell or repair and to let it rot. Charles had heard the stories, how the last of the servants had fled in the night, how the villagers refused to cross the boundary after dark, how the very land seemed cursed. It was said that nothing grew in the gardens, that the animals shunned the place, that even the birds did not sing. As he pushed open the heavy oak door, its creak a mournful cry in the stillness, Charles felt the weight of his ancestors pressing down on him. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and disuse. The grand foyer, once a testament to the Redmayne fortune, was now a mausoleum of faded glory. The cracked marble floors, the tarnished chandeliers, the moth-eaten tapestries all spoke of a time long past, time when the estate had been alive with the laughter of guests, the clink of glasses, the rustle of silk. But those days were gone, buried beneath layers of dust and despair. Now there was only silence and the echoes of footsteps that had long since faded into oblivion. Charles set down his suitcase, the sound of it hitting the floor unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. He could feel the estate watching him, as if the very walls had eyes, as if the shadows themselves were alive, waiting for him to make the first move. A shiver ran down his spine, and he told himself it was just the cold, but deep down he knew better. As he stood in the foyer, his breath visible in the frigid air, Charles felt the heavy burden of the past settling on his shoulders. The estate was his now by blood and by law, but as he looked around, he could not shake the feeling that he was not the master here, but a trespasser, an intruder in a place that had been waiting for him, waiting for the last of the Redmaynes to return. And as the shadows closed in around him, he could not help but wonder if he had made a terrible mistake in coming here. The first night in the estate was marked by a strange unease that settled over Charles like a second skin. He could not shake the feeling of being watched of unseen eyes following his every move. The rooms were cold, impossibly so, and no amount of firewood seemed to chase away the creeping frost that licked at his bones. The estate was a decaying labyrinth, its grandeur now a cruel parody of what it had once been. Each room was a study in decline, once sumptuous drapes now hung in tatters, their colours fade to dull, lifeless shades. The furniture, carved from rich mahogany and oak, was draped in thick layers of dust, the wood split and warped from years of neglect. Mirrors once gilded and gleaming were tarnished and cracked, their reflections distorted, as if the very glass had grown weary of. The floors creaked underfoot, as though they too bore the weight of centuries of secrets, reluctant to reveal them to any living soul. As Charles wandered the halls, the oppressive silence wrapped around him like a shroud, and for a fleeting moment he wondered if there was truth in the villagers' words. There was something alive in these walls, something ancient, brooding. It was as if the estate itself had absorbed the grief and rage of those who had lived here, and now it waited hungry for someone to suffer with it. He found the portrait of the Snow Bride in a room that was unlike the others, a room that seemed almost untouched by the decay that plagued the rest of the estate. The moment he crossed the threshold, Charles felt a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle yet undeniable change that set his nerves on edge. The air here was colder, sharper, carrying a fainter scent of something he couldn't quite place, something the back of his neck stand on end, and the walls were lined with dark wood panelling, and the furniture, though covered in dust, retained an eerie semblance of its former elegance. Heavy velvet curtains, once a deep crimson, now hung like bloodstains again. The portrait hung above the fireplace, dominating the room with an almost unnatural presence. The woman in the painting was draped in a bridal gown, the fabric as white as freshly fallen snow, her long hair a cascade of phrase of haunting beauty. But it was her eyes that held Charles' captive eyes, the colour of a winter sky, filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to seep from the very canvas. It was as though she was looking directly at him through him, seeing into the darkest corners of his soul. He knew at once who she was, though he could not say how. Perhaps it was the way the artist had captured the terrible sadness in her gaze, or perhaps it was the stories he had heard as a child, the whispered legends of the Snow Bride. She was the woman whose tragic fate had become a cautionary tale, a ghost story told to frighten children into behaving. But this was no mere storybook character. This was Evelyn, the woman whose life had been stolen from her on what should have been the happiest day of her life. She had died here on the estate, her body found frozen in the snow the morning after her wedding was supposed to have taken place. Betrayed by the man she loved, abandoned at the altar, Evelyn had waited for hours in the bitter cold, her heart breaking with each passing moment. When she realized he was not coming, that he would never come, something inside her had shattered. She had wandered into the nightless bear until the cold finally claimed her. They found her the next day, her lips blue, her eyes wide open, as if in search of the one who had condemned her to this fate. Charles felt a strange kinship with the woman in the portrait, a connection that was both unsettling and irresistible. He found himself drawn to the portrait night after night, unable to resist the pull of her sorrowful eyes. Each time he gazed upon her, the air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, more menacing. It was as if the very room had become an extension of the Snow Bride herself, a place of mourning, of longing, of vengeance. The other rooms in the estate were dead, decaying relics of a forgotten time, but this room was alive, throbbing with an energy that Charles could not fully understand. It was as if the portrait itself held the soul of the woman it depicted, as if she was still there, trapped within the frame, waiting for something or someone to release her. The more he stared into her eyes, the more he felt her sorrow twist into fury, a cold, seething rage that seemed to wrap around his heart, squeezing it until he could barely breathe. He wanted to turn away, to flee from the room, from the estate, from the curse that had haunted his family for generations. But he could not. The Snow Bride held him fast, her grip on his soul tightening with each passing day. He could not shake the feeling that she was watching him, judging him, waiting for him to make amends for the sins of his ancestors. And though he knew it was madness, he began to speak to her, to apologize for the wrongs done to her, to beg for her forgiveness. But the Snow Bride did not respond. She merely stared at him, her eyes unblinking, unforgiving. As the nights wore on, the rest of the estate began to reflect the change in Charles. The once silent halls were now filled with strange noises, the sound of footsteps, faint murmur of voices in the distance, the soft rustling of fabric when no one was there. The walls seemed to close in on him, the darkness pressing down like a weight on his chest. The estate had become a prison, and the Snow Bride its warden, holding him captive in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The dreams began soon after, creeping into Charles's sleep, like the first tendrils of frost on a window pane. At first they were fleeting, half-formed images that dissipated with the dawn, leaving only a lingering sense of unease. But as the nights wore on, the dreams became more vivid, more terrifying, until they were no longer dreams at all, but a second life lived in the twilight realm between sleep and waking. He felt them in his very bones, the way one feels the chill of winter long after the snow has melted. In these dreams, Charles was not himself, but a man from a different time, a time when the estate had been alive, when its halls had echoed with laughter and the clink of crystal glasses. He would find himself standing in the snow-covered garden, his breath a pale mist in the icy air. The world around him was silent, still, as if it had been carved from marble, each detail etched with exquisite precision. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the cold biting at his cheeks, yet he felt none. It was as if he were a ghost, drifting through a memory that was not his own. And then she would appear. The Snow Bride, Evelyn, stepped out from the shadows like a figure from a dream or perhaps a nightmare. She was more beautiful than he had ever imagined, her hair a cascade of silver, her skin as the snow that surrounded her. Her gown flowed around her like a mist, ethereal and otherworldly, catching the light of the moon in a way that made it seem almost alive. Her beauty was so breathtaking, so perfect, that it filled Charles with a longing so deep it was almost painful. But there was something else, too, a fear that gnawed at his insides, terror that gripped him every time her gaze met his. Her eyes were the worst of all. In them he saw not just sorrow, but a cold, unyielding rage, a fury that had been festering for centuries, waiting for this moment for him. She would reach out to him, her fingers like ice against his skin, and in that touch he felt the weight of her suffering, the depth of her despair. It was as if she were pouring her very soul into him, forcing him to feel every ounce of the pain she had endured. The grief was overwhelming, a crushing force that left him gasping for breath, drowning in a sea of emotions that were not his own. These dreams, if they could be called that, went on for weeks. Each night they grew more intense, more real, until Charles could no longer distinguish them from reality. The lines between the two worlds blurred, and he began to fear sleep, knowing that when he closed his eyes he would be drawn back to that garden, to that moment of horror and beauty that seemed to stretch on forever. Yet he could not resist. There was a part of him that longed for those dreams, that craved the connection he felt with her, no matter how terrifying it was. The villagers had warned him, had told him of the curse of the snow bride who haunted the estate. But Charles had dismissed their words as superstition, the ramblings of old men who had lived too long in the shadow of the past. He had not believed in the legend then, had not believed in ghosts or curses. But now, after what he had seen, what he had felt, he could no longer deny it. The Snow Bride was real, her spirit trapped within the walls of the estate, bound by a hatred so fierce that it had Why didn't he leave? The question tormented him in the rare moments of clarity when he was awake. The answer was not simple, for there were many reasons. At first it was pride. He was a Redmayne, and this estate was his by right. He would not be driven out by mere stories, by the spectre of a long-dead woman. But as the days turned into weeks, as the dreams became his reality, pride was replaced by something else, a need to understand, to uncover the truth of what had happened here, to confront the legacy that had been thrust upon him. And there was the pull of the Snow Bride herself. She held him fast, like a moth drawn to the flame, unable to turn away even as he knew it would consume. Charles was both mesmerized and terrified by her. In his dreams, she was more than just a ghost. She was a force of nature, beautiful and deadly, as inevitable as the coming of winter. Her beauty was a weapon, one that cut through his defenses, leaving him vulnerable and exposed to. Yet, no matter how much he feared her, he could not deny the connection he felt. It was as if they were bound together by some invisible thread, their fates intertwined by the sins of his ancestors. By day, he wandered the empty halls of the estate, the memories of his dreams haunting him, the weight of the past pressing down on his shoulders. The estate itself seemed to mock him, its crumbling walls and decaying rooms a reflection of the madness that was slowly creeping into his mind. He would find himself in the garden, staring at the spot where she had appeared in his dreams, waiting for her to return, knowing that she would, knowing that there was no escape. He had come to the estate as a man of reason, a man who did not believe in ghosts or curses, but now he was a man on the edge, caught between the living and the dead, between the world of the waking and the world of dreams. The Snow Bride had claimed him, and there was no going back. The curse of the Redmayne bloodline began with Edward, a man whose ambition and cruelty knew no bounds. Edward had been a figure of power and influence, feared and revered in equal measure. But it was not his wealth or his titles that sealed his family's fate. It was the betrayal of a woman whose heart he had promised, only to shatter it without remorse. Evelyn had not been a witch, not in the way the fearful villagers might have believed. She was something far more ancient, more enigmatic, a woman with a deep connection to the earth, a healer whose hands could coax life from the soil and mend the wounds of both body and spirit. She was beloved by the land, and in turn, she loved it with a devotion that was as fierce as it was pure. But Evelyn's power was not one of spells and potions. It was subtler, rooted in the very essence of the natural world, in the cycles of life and death, in the unspoken language of the seasons. When Edward, in his arrogance, discarded her for a more advantageous match, he did more than break a heart, he desecrated something sacred. Evelyn's love for him had been genuine, untainted by the ambitions that drove him. She had believed in the future they would share, had woven hopes and dreams into the very fabric of the estate they were to call home. But when he abandoned her, leaving her to wait in the snow for a promise that would never be fulfilled, something within her snapped. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, that it resonated through the land itself, calling upon the ancient forces that lay dormant within her. Evelyn had not sought revenge in the conventional sense. She had not cast spells or summoned dark spirits to do her bidding. Instead, her grief and rage, fueled by the injustice done to her, had awakened something within her, something older than memory, something that tied her soul to the land in a way that no mortal could understand. In that moment of utter despair, Evelyn became one with the earth, her spirit merging with the cold, unforgiving landscape. She became a manifestation of winter's fury, a spectre of ice and sorrow bound to the estate and the man who had wronged her. Edward's sin did not go unpunished. Evelyn's transformation into the Snow Bride was the genesis of a curse that would plague the Redmayne line for generations. The land itself turned against him, the once fertile fields becoming barren, the rivers running dry. And as Evelyn's rage deepened, it spread to the bloodline of the man who had betrayed her. Each descendant would inherit the curse, their lives marred by tragedy, madness, and death, until the wrongs of the past were made right. In the cold, dead light of his solitude, Charles pondered these truths, piecing together the fragments of the curse that had come to dominate his existence. Evelyn had become something more than a vengeful ghost. She was the embodiment of the land's anger, a spirit bound by a pain that could not be soothed. Her power was not one that could be exorcised or banished by any priest or ritual. It was a part of the estate itself, woven into the fabric of the earth, as immutable as the stones that made up its foundations. Yet Charles could not help but wonder if there was a way to break the curse, a way to free Evelyn from the chains of her own rage. If she had become one with the land, perhaps there was a way to sever that bond, to release her spirit from the cycle of suffering that had held her captive for so long. But how? How could he hope to undo a curse that had been centuries in the making? The library became his sanctuary, the place where he sought answers, though the books offered little in the way of hope. The texts he found spoke of spirits and curses, of rituals that might placate a vengeful ghost, but none seemed to fit the unique nature of Evelyn's plight. She was not a simple spirit, but a force of nature, a being whose power was tied to the land itself. The more he read, the more solace that the answer would not be found in the dusty pages of old tomes. It would have to be something more personal, something that spoke to the heart of the curse itself. Charles began to theorize that the key to breaking the curse lay not in confronting Evelyn as an enemy, but in understanding her as a woman whose pain had been so great that it had transcended death. Perhaps if he could find a way to reach her, to show her that he was not like his ancestor, that he sought to make amends, he could begin to unravel the threads of the curse that bound them both. But the estate seemed to conspire against him, the air growing colder, the shadows deeper, as if the very walls were resisting his efforts. The dreams grew more intense, more vivid. Evelyn's presence in every corner, in every breath he took. She was beautiful in those dreams, her face a mask of sorrow and longing, but her beauty was tempered by the cold fury that lurked beneath. He could not escape the feeling that she was testing him, waiting for him to make a mistake, to fail in his quest for redemption. The closer he came to understanding the curse, the more dangerous the dreams became. Evelyn's gaze, once filled with sorrow, now burned with a cold, unforgiving light, as if she were daring him to continue, daring him to find the answer that eluded him. The estate itself seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. Charles knew that time was running out. The curse had claimed many before him, and he could feel its icy grip tightening around his heart. But he could not give up. He had to find a way to break the cycle, to free Evelyn from the torment that had captive for so long, so long. The answer was there, somewhere, hidden in the mists of the past, waiting to be uncovered. And as he delved deeper into the mysteries of the estate, he could not shake the feeling that Evelyn was watching him, guiding him, testing him. The Snow Bride was more than just a spirit of vengeance. She was the key to his salvation, and perhaps in some twisted way he was the key to hers. But the path ahead was fraught with danger, and Charles knew that one wrong step could seal his fate, and the fate of all who bore the Redmayne name. The endgame was approaching, and with it the final reckoning between the living and the dead. Charles could only hope that he would find the answer before it was too late, before the curse claimed him as it had claimed so many before. But in his heart he knew that the answer was not one of logic or reason, it was one of emotion, of understanding the depths of Evelyn's pain and finding a way to heal the wounds that had festered for centuries. The question was, could he do it? Could he find a way to break the curse and free them both? Or would he be doomed to repeat the sins of his ancestors, lost forever in the icy embrace of the Snow Bride? The nights had grown longer, the darkness stretching out like an endless sea, swallowing the light and leaving only shadows in its wake. The estate, once a place of cold, crumbling stone, had become a labyrinth of dreams and nightmares, where the boundaries between the living and the dead no longer existed. And at the heart of it all was Evelyn, the Snow Bride, whose essence permeated every corner, every breath Charles took. She came to him in the night, as she always did, her form emerging from the mist, like a memory half forgotten. Her face was as beautiful as ever, a mask of sorrow and longing, but her eyes, those eyes that had once held the depths of the earth and sky, were now filled with something else, something that made Charles's heart seize with both fear and desperation. He had tried to unravel the curse, to find a way to break the bonds that held them both captive. But the more he searched, the more elusive the answers became. And so, in the stillness of the night, with the weight of centuries pressing down upon him, Charles realized there was only one course left to him. He had to confront her, to face the Snow Bride, and ask the questions that had haunted him since he first set foot in the estate. When Evelyn appeared in the dim light of the moon, her gown shimmering like frost, Charles found the courage he thought he had lost. His voice, trembling, yet resolute, broke the silence. Evelyn, he called, his words hanging in the air like a prayer. What do you want? The question lingered between them, the cold air thick with the tension of 1,000 unspoken truths. For a moment Evelyn did not respond, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his breath catch. But then, slowly, she began to speak, her voice like the wind through the trees, soft and mournful. I want justice, she said, her words carrying the weight of centuries of pain. I want what was taken from me. Charles felt a chill run through him, not from the cold, but from the realization that her pain was deeper than he had imagined. He had expected anger, fury even, but what he saw in her eyes was something far more profound, an endless well of sorrow, a longing for something that had been lost to time. "What was taken from you?" he asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "My life," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. "My love, my future, all taken from me by a man who cared for nothing but his own desires." Charles felt the weight of her words like a stone in his chest. This was no ordinary curse, no simple act of vengeance. Evelyn had been wronged in the most fundamental way, and the curse was not just her retribution, it was the embodiment of the injustice she had suffered, a wound that had never healed. He took a step closer to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "But do you wish to remain here?" he asked, his voice filled with both hope and fear. "Do you wish to be bound to this place forever, to live in this sorrow for all eternity?" Evelyn's gaze wavered, as if the question had caught her off guard. For a moment the fury in her eyes seemed to dim, replaced by something else, something that Charles could not quite decipher. She looked away, her eyes drifting to the snow-covered landscape outside the window. "I do not know," she admitted, her voice softer now, more vulnerable. "This place is all I have known since that night. It is where I died, where my heart was shattered. It is where I became what I am." Charles felt a surge of desperation. He had to reach her, had to find a way to break through the barrier that had kept her trapped in this endless cycle of pain. "Evelyn," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "please, let me help you. Let me go so that I can find a way to free you from this curse. I don't want to be your enemy, and I don't want to be another link in this chain of suffering. If there is any part of you that still remembers what it was like to love, to hope, then please let me help you." For a moment the silence was so complete that Charles could hear his own heartbeat, loud and frantic in his ears. Evelyn remained motionless, her expression unreadable, as if she were struggling with something deep within herself. And then, slowly, she turned to face him once more. "You speak of love," she said, her voice tinged with both bitterness and longing. "But what do you know of love, Charles Redmayne? What do you know of the pain that comes when it is ripped away from you, leaving nothing but emptiness and despair?" "I know," Charles whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I know because I see it in you, Evelyn. I see the love you had, the love that was stolen from you. And I see how it has turned into something dark, something that is destroying you as much as it is destroying me. But it doesn't have to be this way. If you let me go, I can find a way to end this, to free you from this torment." Evelyn's gaze bore into him, her eyes searching his, as if trying to determine whether he spoke the truth. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of centuries of pain and betrayal. Charles held his breath, waiting for her response, praying that she would find it in her heart to trust him, to let him go so that he could help her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Evelyn spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Very well, Charles Redmayne," she said, her words carrying the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. "I will let you go. But know this, if you fail, if you betray me as your ancestor did, you will find no mercy in death. The curse will claim you just as it has claimed all who came before you." Charles felt a mixture of relief and dread wash over him. He had been given a chance, but it was a precarious one, fraught with danger. The fate of both himself and Evelyn rested on his shoulders, and the burden was almost too much to bear. But he knew that this was the only way, the only path left to him. "I won't fail you," he vowed, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. "I will find a way to free you, Evelyn, I swear it." With that, the snow bride began to fade, her form dissolving into the mist, until there was nothing left but the cold air and the darkness that surrounded him. Charles was left alone, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of his promise hanging over him like a sword. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and doubt. But for the first time there was a glimmer of hope, a chance to break the curse that had bound them both for so long. Charles knew that the road would be difficult, that the answers he sought would not come easily, but he also knew that he could not turn back, that he could not abandon Evelyn to her fate. As he stood in the silence of the estate, Charles felt a resolve take hold of him, a determination to see this through to the end. The Snow Bride had given him a chance, and he would not waste it. He would find a way to ask to free Evelyn from the chains of the past, and perhaps in doing so he would find a way to redeem not only his own soul, but the soul of the woman who had been wronged so many years ago. The journey was far from over, but Charles knew that he had taken the first step, and with that step came the possibility of something more, something that had been denied to both him and Evelyn for so long. Freedom. The estate was shrouded in a silence so profound that it seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the land itself. Charles felt the weight of the cold air pressing against his skin, a reminder of the presence that lingered just beyond the veil of the living world. As he stood there alone in the heart of the ancient mansion, the full realization of what he had promised began to sink in. The Snow Bride had agreed to let him go, but the fear that she might change her mind gnawed at him like a hungry beast. Each step he took away from the room where she had appeared felt like an eternity. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest, as if trying to escape the icy grip of the curse that had claimed so many before him. The walls of the estate seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing longer, darker, as if they were reaching out to drag him back into the abyss from which he had only just emerged. He wanted to run, to flee from the estate and never look back, but something held him in place. The memory of Evelyn's face, of the sorrow that had etched itself into her features, was burned into his mind. That he had seen her pain, felt the depth of her despair, and it terrified him. But what scared him more was the thought that he might not be able to help her, that he might fail in his promise and be consumed by the curse that had haunted his family for generations. The fear of the Snow Bride was a living thing, a shadow that followed him through the halls, whispering of the cold vengeance that had kept her bound to the estate for so long. But there was another fear, one that cut even deeper, the fear of becoming like her, of being trapped in a cycle of hatred and sorrow that would never end. He could feel the curse in his blood, a dark presence that threatened to devour him whole if he let it. But in the end, the Snow Bride did let him go. The air grew still, the shadows retreating as if they had lost their strength. Charles stood in the centre of the room, trembling with both relief and sadness. He was free, but he knew that freedom had come at a cost. The Snow Bride, Evelyn, could never stop haunting the estate. Her vengeance had been aimed at Edward, a man long dead, and without him there was no release from the pain that had bound her to this place. Charles's heart ached with a sorrow that was not entirely his own. He had wanted to save her, to give her the peace she so desperately needed, but he knew now that her fate was sealed. Evelyn was a part of it as the stones and the earth itself. She had become the embodiment of the pain and betrayal that had defined her life, and nothing he could do would change that. As she turned her back on him, her form fading into the mist, she whispered a final farewell, her voice so soft it was almost lost to the wind. There was something in her tone, a hint of resignation, perhaps even a trace of hope that made her sweet longing. Maybe, just maybe, she could find rest after all. It was a fragile hope, but it was all he had to hold on to as he watched her disappear into the shadows. In the days that followed, Charles commissioned a grave to be placed on the estate grounds. A simple stone marker inscribed with her name, Evelyn. He wanted the world to remember her not as the Snow Bride, not as a vengeful spirit, but as the woman she had once been, a woman of warmth and love, whose life had been stolen from her by a man who had never deserved her. The plaque was a promise, a vow that her memory would not be forgotten. And so, year after year, Charles returned to her grave, bringing the flowers she had once loved, their delicate petals a stark contrast to the cold, barren land that surrounded them. He would stand there in silence, his thoughts turning to the woman who had haunted his dreams, who had shown him the depths of both her pain and her strength. He grew old in the shadow of the estate, his hair turning silver, his steps slowing with the passage of time. But he never stopped visiting her, never stopped hoping that one day he might catch a glimpse of her again, even if only for a moment. But Evelyn never showed herself, not even in the dreams that had once been filled with her presence. As the years wore on, Charles found himself wondering if perhaps by some otherworldly power Evelyn had been released. Perhaps the act of remembering her, of honouring her as the woman she had once been, had warmed her heart enough to give her the strength to let go of her vengeance. He could never be sure, but it was a comfort thought, one that he clung to as he grew older, his own time in this world drawing to a close. In his final days, Charles often found himself sitting by Evelyn's grave, the flowers in bloom around him, their scent carried on the breeze. He would close his eyes and listen to the wind, hoping to hear her voice, to feel her presence one last time. But the estate remained silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. When he passed away, the estate finally fell into peace, a quiet that had been absent for so long. The curse that had haunted the Redmayne line was no more, its final victim taken not by the Snowbride's hand, but by the passage of time. The estate, once a place of sorrow and death, was now a resting place, a sanctuary where both the living and the dead could find peace. Charles's grave was placed beside Evelyn's, a simple stone marker that bore his name. And so, in death, he found the peace that had eluded him in life, resting beside the woman whose story had become entwined with his own. The estate remains to this day a relic of a time long past, where the wind whispers through the trees and the snow falls in gentle silence. Visitors come and go, some sensing the lingering presence of those who once lived and died there. But there is no fear, no sense of dread, only the quiet memory of a love that was lost and the hope that, in the end, both Charles and Evelyn found the peace they had sought for so long. And perhaps, just perhaps, in the quiet of a winter's night, if one listens closely enough, they might hear the soft, distant laughter of a woman whose heart was finally freed from the chains of sorrow. And so our journey through the darkness comes to an end, at least for tonight. But remember, the shadows are always there, waiting for our return. I am Mooncat, and I thank you for daring to walk these haunted paths with me. If you wish to continue exploring the unknown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until we meet again, may the night be kind and the shadows gentle. Farewell for now.